December 14th, 1803. Bantry Bay, County Cork, Ireland. When British Customs Officer Lieutenant James Wardlow seized the fishing vessel Mary Catherine during a routine contraband inspection, he expected to find French brandy, perhaps Spanish tobacco. What he discovered instead would expose one of the most ingenious espionage networks in Irish rebel history. Hidden beneath false floorboards, Wardlow found not smuggled goods, but 27 trained ferrets, each wearing tiny leather harnesses. When he examined one of these harnesses more closely, his hands began to tremble. Sewn into the lining were coded messages written on silk paper, communications between French military officials and Irish rebels still loyal to Wolfe Tone's failed revolution. The ferrets weren't just cargo, they were couriers. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple spy network. What investigators would uncover over the following months revealed a conspiracy that had been operating for 5 years, right under the Crown's nose, using Ireland's countryside and its most humble creatures to plan an invasion that could have changed the course of European history. Before we uncover the truth about the Bantry Bay smugglers' ferrets and how the ghosts of Wolfe Tone's rebellion nearly brought French troops back to Irish shores, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard whispers of this forgotten chapter of Irish history. Now let's descend into the shadows of 1803, where rebellion still smoldered and the line between patriot and traitor depended entirely on who told the story. Ireland in 1803 was a powder keg wrapped in the illusion of peace. Just 5 years earlier, the catastrophic Irish Rebellion of 1798 had been brutally suppressed. Theobald Wolfe Tone, the charismatic leader who had sought French assistance to overthrow British rule, had died in prison under suspicious circumstances, officially a suicide, though many believed otherwise. The Act of Union had followed in 1801, dissolving the Irish Parliament and binding Ireland more tightly to the British Crown. To the world, the matter appeared settled. But in the coastal villages of County Cork, resentment simmered like peat smoke. Bantry Bay itself held symbolic weight for those who remembered. In December 1796, a massive French fleet carrying over 14,000 troops had anchored in these very waters, prepared to support an Irish uprising. Only fierce winter storms had prevented the landing, storms that loyalists called divine intervention and rebels called cruel fate. The ships had turned back, and with them, Ireland's best chance at independence in a generation. By 1803, British authorities believed the rebel spirit had been sufficiently crushed. They were wrong. The coastal region between Bantry and Bearhaven had always existed in a gray zone of legality. Smuggling was not merely common, it was an economic necessity. French brandy, Spanish wine, tea from the Indies, these goods moved through the rocky coves and hidden beaches as regularly as the tides. British Navy maintained a presence, of course, but the coastline was too vast, too craggy, too riddled with secret inlets to truly control. Into this landscape came men like Séamus O'Sullivan. A fisherman by trade, O'Sullivan operated the Mary Catherine with his brother Diarmuid and a rotating crew of cousins and nephews. To customs officials, they were known smugglers, but minor ones, occasional offenders who paid their fines when caught and went back to fishing. The O'Sullivans had been working these waters for 3 generations. Their great-grandfather had fished here when the old Gaelic chieftains still held power. They knew every cave, every channel, every place where a small boat could slip past watchful eyes. What no one suspected was that Séamus O'Sullivan was also a commit. Ed Revolutionary, a man who had sworn an oath to Wolfe Tone himself in 1796, and who had spent the intervening years building something extraordinary. The ferret trade in Ireland was unremarkable. Farmers used them for rabbiting, sending the sleek, aggressive animals down burrows to drive out rabbits for food and pest control. Ferrets were common, unregulated, and so ordinary that no one would think twice about seeing them transported between villages. They were, in the language of espionage, perfectly invisible. And Séamus O'Sullivan had recognized their potential. Escalating incidents 5 to 10 minutes, the pattern began in 1799, though no one connected the pieces at the time. That spring, British garrison commander Colonel Percival Thornbury noted in his official correspondence an unusual uptick in French naval activity off the Cork coast. Ships that appeared to be merchant vessels would anchor briefly in international waters, then depart. No cargo was offloaded. No obvious communication with shore occurred. Thornbury increased coastal patrols, but the sightings continued sporadically throughout the year. What frustrated the colonel most was the rebels' apparent foreknowledge of his troop movements. In August 1799, Thornbury planned a surprise raid on a suspected rebel meeting in the village of Durras, 12 miles from Bantry. He had shared the plans with only his most trusted officers, yet when his men arrived at dawn, they found an empty cottage and cold ashes in the fireplace. Someone had warned them. But how? The second incident occurred in March 1801. A French agent named Philippe Ducasse was captured near Skibbereen carrying coded letters intended for persons of interest in County Cork. Under interrogation, Ducasse revealed that he had never met his Irish contacts directly. Instead, he claimed, he would leave his messages in a hollowed rock near Lough Hyne and return 3 days later to find responses waiting. British investigators found the rock, examined it thoroughly, and set a watch. For 3 months, nothing happened. Eventually, they concluded Ducasse had lied to protect his network. They never considered that the communication method had simply changed. By 1802, Colonel Thornbury had become quietly obsessed. He knew that information was flowing between Irish rebels and French operatives. He knew his own garrison had been penetrated or observed. But every investigation led nowhere. Interrogations yielded nothing. Seized correspondence revealed no obvious codes. The rebels he arrested were small-time, ignorant of any larger network. "It is as though our enemies speak through the very stones and wind," he wrote to his superiors in Dublin Castle, a line that would later seem prophetic. The third incident should have broken the case open. In June 1803, a customs cutter intercepted the Mary Catherine 3 miles offshore. Lieutenant Wardlow himself led the inspection. They found contraband, 6 casks of French brandy and bolts of Spanish lace, exactly what they expected. Séamus O'Sullivan paid his fine without complaint, smiled his weathered fisherman's smile and went on his way. What Wardlow remembered later, during his testimony, was the ferrets. There had been a cage in the hold containing perhaps a dozen of the animals. When he'd asked about them, O'Sullivan had explained they were being transported to a farmer in Castletownbere for rabbiting purposes. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Wardlow had noted it in his report and thought nothing more of it, except for one detail that nagged at him. The ferrets had been wearing small harnesses, leather straps around their bodies. O'Sullivan claimed these prevented them from escaping when released into rabbit warrens. Again, plausible. Ferrets were sometimes harnessed for hunting. But something about those harnesses bothered Wardlow. They seemed too well made, too purposeful. Years of customs work had given him an instinct for wrongness, and those harnesses fey. LT wrong. He did nothing about this instinct. Not yet. The fourth incident was a near disaster for the spy network. In October 1803, a ferret escaped its handler in the village of Ballydehab. The animal, still wearing its harness, was caught by a local boy named Thomas Fitzpatrick, who brought it to his father. The elder Fitzpatrick examined the harness and found it oddly constructed. The leather was unusually thick in one section. Being poor and practical, he cut the harness to repurpose the leather. Inside, he found a thin piece of silk paper covered in strange symbols. Fitzpatrick couldn't read English, let alone coded French military correspondence, but he knew unusual when he saw it. He brought the paper to Father Brendan Connolly, the parish priest. Father Connolly, educated at seminary in France before the Revolution, recognized the language immediately. His hands shook as he read coordinates, ship names, and dates. The priest faced an impossible decision. He was a man of God, sworn to honor legitimate authority, but he was also Irish, son of a land crushed beneath foreign rule. He had heard the confessions of starving families, blessed the graves of rebels hanged without trial. Whatever this paper represented, turning it over to British authorities felt like betrayal of his flock. Father Connolly burned the paper in his fireplace. Then he sent word to Séamus O'Sullivan through channels he would never reveal, even years later when historians came asking. One of O'Sullivan's ferrets had been compromised. The network needed to know. This act of mercy, or treason depending on one's perspective, kept the operation running for 2 more crucial months. But it also meant that when the network finally fell, the collapse would be sudden and total. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The truth about how this spy network operated gets even more incredible. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten history. Let's discover what happens next. The moment when Lieutenant Wardlow's instincts finally led him to a discovery that would shock military intelligence on both sides of the Irish Sea. December 14, 1803 began as a routine patrol. Lieutenant James Wardlow had been conducting coastal inspections for 7 years. At 32, he was methodical, patient, and had learned to trust the small inconsistencies that others dismissed. That morning, his cutter intercepted the Mary Catherine returning from what O'Sullivan claimed was a fishing run. The hold contained a modest catch of mackerel and cod, nothing suspicious. But Wardlow remembered the ferrets from June. "Open the cargo hold fully," he ordered his men. "Everything visible." Séamus O'Sullivan maintained his composure, the easy smile of a man with nothing to hide. His brother Diarmwood leaned against the mast, watching gulls. Neither showed concern. The ferrets were there again. 27 of them this time, in 3 wooden cages, all wearing those peculiar harnesses. Wardlow lifted one of the cages into the light. The ferrets hissed and scrambled, their musky scent strong in the salt air. He removed one animal, a cream-colored Jill, and examined its harness while his men held the writhing creature steady. The leather was fine quality, sewn with unusual precision for something destined to be dragged through dirt and rabbit warrens. Wardlow ran his fingers along the straps, feeling for irregularities. There, a seam along the animal's spine where 2 pieces of leather had been stitched together with almost invisible thread. The stitching was too perfect, too deliberate. Wardlow drew his knife. "Sir, what do you—" O'Sullivan stepped forward, the mask of ease finally cracking. Wardlow cut the thread. Folded inside the hollow compartment between the outer and inner leather was a piece of silk paper, approximately 2 inches square, covered in dense handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. The text was French, and while Wardlow's command of the L.A. Wood was limited, certain words were unmistakable. Navire ship, soldats, soldiers, janvier, January. "Hold these men," Wardlow said quietly, "and bring me every ferret." What they discovered over the next hour would be documented in meticulous detail in Wardlow's official report, preserved now in the British National Archives. 27 ferrets, each carrying messages in waterproof silk packets sewn into their harnesses. The messages were in French and used a polyalphabetic cipher that would take cryptographers 3 weeks to fully break. But even in their encrypted state, proper nouns were identifiable, names of French naval officers, Irish villages, coordinates in Bantry Bay. The most chilling document was found in the harness of the largest male ferret, a dark sable creature that O'Sullivan had called Bonaparte, with what now seemed like deliberate mockery. This message, dated November 28, 1803, contained detailed information about British troop strength in Cork, the schedule of naval patrols, and the phrase that would dominate subsequent court proceedings: "L'invasion peut procéder comme prévu en janvier." The invasion can proceed as planned in January. Wardlow ordered the Mary Catherine seized and all hands arrested. When he searched the vessel more thoroughly, he found additional evidence: a false compartment containing breeding cages, training equipment, and a leather-bound ledger documenting 5 years of ferret courier operations. The ledger was written in Irish Gaelic mixed with English and French, a linguistic blend that perfectly represented the international conspiracy it recorded. The entries revealed an operation of stunning sophistication. Ferrets were bred specifically for temperament and size. Young kits were trained to tolerate harnesses and to remain calm during boat transport. The animals were rotated regularly to prevent any single ferret from becoming too recognizable. Routes varied. Sometimes the ferrets traveled with O'Sullivan's fishing crews. Sometimes they were sold to legitimate farmers who unknowingly transported spy messages alongside their new rabbiting animals. Most ingeniously, the network had established collection points at working farms throughout County Cork. A French agent could leave a message at a designated location, often literally buried in a ferret burrow, and Irish rebels would retrieve it using ferrets trained to navigate specific warren systems. The animal's natural hunting behavior provided perfect cover for covert communication. When Wardlow's men searched O'Sullivan's cottage in Bantry, they found the breeding operation. 43 ferrets in various stages of training, harnesses in different sizes, silk paper prepared with weather-resistant treatment, and in a locked sea chest, correspondence with French naval intelligence dating back to 1798, confirming that this network had been operational since immediately after Wolfe Tone's death. Séamus O'Sullivan had built a living, breathing espionage network from creatures most people considered simple farm animals. The discovery sent shockwaves through British military command. How many messages had been passed? How much intelligence had reached France? What other plans might be in motion? And most urgently, was there truly an invasion planned for January? The interrogations began immediately, but Séamus O'Sullivan was no amateur conspirator. For 3 weeks he maintained absolute silence. British authorities transferred him to Cork City Jail, then to the more secure facilities at Dublin Castle, when it became clear he would not break easily. His brother Diarmwood proved equally stubborn. The other crew members claimed ignorance. They had believed the ferrets were simply smuggled goods, no different than French brandy. This claim was partly credible. The network had been deliberately compartmentalized. Most of those involved knew only their specific role. Fishermen transported cages. Farmers provided collection points. C. Couriers moved messages without understanding their contents. Only O'Sullivan and a handful of coordinators understood the full scope. The cryptographers, meanwhile, worked around the clock. The Cipher proved to be a sophisticated variant of the Vigenère system, using a keyword that changed with each message. Eventually, through a combination of frequency analysis and captured plaintext fragments, they broke enough messages to piece together the conspiracy's shape. The intelligence was devastating. For 5 years, French military planners had been receiving detailed reports on British force disposition in Ireland, naval patrol patterns, political sentiment in various counties, and the readiness of potential rebel forces. The messages revealed that French interest in Ireland had never truly waned after 1798. It had merely become more patient, more careful. The invasion plan referenced in the November message was real. According to decrypted correspondence, a French fleet of approximately 12 ships carrying 3,000 troops was being assembled at Brest with the intention of landing at Bantry Bay in mid-January 1804. The operation was designed to coincide with a planned uprising in Dublin led by Robert Emmet's associates. Though Emmet himself had already been executed in September for his failed July rebellion, his network remained partially intact. The Ferret network was supposed to provide final confirmation that conditions were favorable for landing. British response was immediate and overwhelming. The Channel Fleet was reinforced. Garrison strength in Ireland was doubled. Known associates of the United Irishmen were arrested preemptively. In France, increased British naval presence forced postponement of the planned expedition. By February 1804, the invasion plan had been abandoned entirely, though this cancellation owed as much to Napoleon's shifting strategic priorities as to the network's exposure. But what of Séamus O'Sullivan and his Confederates? The legal proceedings were complicated by politics. Dublin Castle wanted public trials to demonstrate British competence and deter future conspiracies. However, the trials would necessarily reveal how long the spy network had operated undetected, an embarrassment that made officials reluctant to pursue full prosecution. The compromise was bureaucratic efficiency. In March 1804, O'Sullivan and 8 other key members of the network were convicted of high treason in proceedings that lasted less than a week. The trial was held in Dublin rather than Cork, minimizing local sympathy. Evidence was presented in summary form to avoid revealing the full extent of British intelligence failures. The verdict was predetermined. Séamus O'Sullivan was hanged on April 3, 1804, at Kilmainham Gaol. Historical accounts suggest he remained defiant to the end. His final words, recorded by a sympathetic prison chaplain, were in Irish Gaelic: "Bade Arla again fos. Our day will still come." His brother Diarmid and 3 others received the same sentence. 4 conspirators were transported to the penal colonies in Australia, a fate considered by many to be worse than hanging. The remaining network members received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But the story did not end with these executions. In the months following the trials, British authorities attempted to trace the network's full extent. They discovered collection points at 17 farms across Cork and Kerry. They identified 6 French agents who had operated in Ireland between 1799 and 1803, though most had already returned to France. They found evidence suggesting the network had connections to rebel groups in other counties, though these links were never fully proven. Most disturbing to British intelligence was evidence that O'Sullivan had been planning to expand the operation. Documents found in his cottage included notes on training other animals, carrier pigeons, dogs, even cats, for message transport. There were sketches for more sophisticated harnesses and waterproofing techniques. O'Sullivan had been systematizing his methods, preparing to teach others and scale the operation beyond what one man could personally manage. The investigation also revealed uncomfortable truths about collaboration. Several local officials had been complicit, if not through active assistance, then through willful ignorance. Father Connolly's role in warning the network about the compromised ferret eventually came to light, though he was never prosecuted. The Crown was reluctant to create an Irish martyr by executing a priest. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to a remote parish in Donegal, where he lived until his death in 1831. The fishermen and farmers who had transported ferrets without realizing their purpose faced an ambiguous status. Most were questioned and released. Some genuinely had been ignorant. Others had suspected something irregular but asked no questions, a kind of passive resistance common in occupied territories. The ferrets themselves met various fates. Some were destroyed as evidence. Others were sold to farmers for their intended rabbiting purpose, though one imagines with considerably more scrutiny. A few ended up in the possession of British intelligence officers as curiosities, living souvenirs of an extraordinary case. Lieutenant James Wardlow received a commendation and promotion for his discovery. His career benefited significantly from what his superiors termed exceptional vigilance. Yet in private correspondence preserved in his family's papers, Wardlow expressed a strange melancholy about the affair. He had admired O'Sullivan's ingenuity even as he condemned his treason. The fisherman had created something genuinely innovative, a spy network that existed in plain sight, using the rhythms of rural life as camouflage. By summer 1804, the ferret network had been dismantled. British authorities believed they had eliminated a dangerous threat. The planned invasion had been prevented. Justice, from the Crown's perspective, had been served. But they had only addressed the symptoms, not the underlying cause. The resentment that drove Séamus O'Sullivan to 5 years of dangerous conspiracy did not disappear with his execution. If anything, the brutality of the response deepened it. The ferret network became part of Irish rebel mythology, proof that Irish ingenuity and commitment could challenge even the British Empire's surveillance apparatus. The Bantry Bay ferret network occupies a unique position in the history of espionage, simultaneously forgotten and influential. In the immediate aftermath, British military intelligence undertook a comprehensive review of counterinsurgency methods in Ireland. The case revealed fundamental flaws in their approach. They had focused on monitoring known rebel leaders and intercepting traditional forms of communication: couriers, dead drops, coded letters. They had not considered that an effective spy network might operate through the mundane infrastructure of rural life. The concept of operational security through ordinariness entered British military doctrine as a direct result of O'Sullivan's methods. Intelligence services began paying attention to agricultural trade, animal transport, and other previously overlooked aspects of daily life in occupied territories. This shift in perspective influenced British colonial intelligence operations throughout the 19th century, from India to South Africa. Ironically, the Irish rebels' innovation strengthened the Empire's ability to suppress future rebellions. The case also highlighted the challenges of controlling information flow in a hostile population. Even with military occupation and martial law, the British had been unable to prevent rebels from communicating with foreign powers. The ferret network demonstrated that where there was community support and local knowledge, sophisticated surveillance could be evaded through creative adaptation. This lesson would be learned repeatedly throughout the colonial era. Populations that wanted to resist would find ways to communicate, regardless of official restrictions. For Irish Republican movements, the ferret network became a powerful symbol. Though the operation ultimately failed, it represented Irish resourcefulness and determination. Later organizations, including the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the 1860s and the IRA in the 20th century, studied O'Sullivan's methods. The principle of using everyday activities as cover for revolutionary work became central to Irish Republican strategy. The network also demonstrated the importance of operational security and compartmentalization, lessons that shaped resistance movements for generations. The story filtered into Irish folklore in interesting ways. By the 1820s, ballads were being sung in Cork pubs about Séamus of the Ferrets and his clever defiance of British authority. These songs conveniently omitted the network's failure in execution, focusing instead on the 5 years when O'Sullivan had outwitted military intelligence. The ferrets themselves became romantic symbols, small, fierce creatures that could slip through the enemy's grasp. From a broader perspective of animal use in espionage, the ferret network represented an early example of biological systems being adapted for intelligence purposes. While carrier pigeons had been used in military communication for centuries, O'Sullivan's approach was more sophisticated. He had essentially created a covert communication infrastructure using living creatures whose presence aroused no suspicion. This concept would be explored again in various conflicts, from dogs carrying messages in World War I to the CIA's Cold War experiments with animals as surveillance platforms. The case also raises questions about the nature of terrorism versus resistance that remain relevant today. From the British perspective, O'Sullivan was a traitor facilitating foreign invasion and terrorist violence. From the Irish Republican perspective, he was a patriot resisting occupation and fighting for national liberation. The same actions, transporting coded military intelligence to support armed conflict against an established government, are framed entirely differently depending on one's political position. This moral ambiguity was not lost on observers even at the time. Some British officials privately expressed grudging respect for O'Sullivan's capabilities even as they condemned his cause. Irish critics of revolutionary violence worried that such conspiracies invited brutal repression that harmed ordinary people. The debate over whether O'Sullivan was a hero or a villain continues in historical circles to this day. The network's exposure also had unintended consequences for French-Irish relations. Napoleon's government, embarrassed by the security breach, became more cautious about supporting Irish revolutionaries. While French interest in using Ireland to threaten Britain never disappeared entirely, the level of active coordination diminished significantly after 1804. The Ferret Network's discovery thus paradoxically reduced the likelihood of French military intervention that might have given Irish independence movements a real chance of success. For historians of technology and innovation, the case offers insights into how necessity drives creativity. O'Sullivan had limited resources, no access to sophisticated technology, no formal intelligence training, no institutional support. Yet he created a system that successfully evaded British counterintelligence for 5 years. His innovation wasn't technological but conceptual, recognizing that inconspicuous methods could be more effective than sophisticated ones. This principle applies far beyond espionage, speaking to how marginalized groups develop adaptive strategies when confronting more powerful opponents. The environmental historian might note something else entirely. The Ferret Network represents humans co-opting a domesticated predator's biology for purposes far removed from its original domestication. Ferrets had been bred for thousands of years to hunt rabbits. O'Sullivan didn't change their fundamental nature, he simply added a secondary purpose that piggybacked on their primary one. The animals continued hunting, the farmers continued rabbiting, but layered beneath this normal activity was a hidden infrastructure serving revolutionary ends. It's a reminder that human systems often contain unintended capacities that creative minds can discover and exploit. Perhaps most significantly, the Bantry Bay Ferret Network demonstrates the limits of technological superiority in asymmetric conflict. Britain had the most powerful navy in the world, sophisticated intelligence networks, and complete military control of Ireland. Yet a fisherman and a few dozen ferrets nearly facilitated a French invasion. Superior force does not guarantee superior information or control. The weak, when sufficiently motivated and clever, can create disproportionate effects through unconventional methods. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Vietnamese using tunnel networks against American technological superiority, Afghan resistance forces using mountains and local knowledge against Soviet and later NATO forces, encrypted messaging apps allowing protesters to coordinate against authoritarian surveillance states. The principle remains constant. Control of physical space does not ensure control of information space, and those who understand local contexts can exploit this gap. The Ferret Network also reminds us that history is full of extraordinary stories that get buried beneath more prominent narratives. The Irish Rebellion of 1798, Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet. These are known chapters in Irish history. But Séamus O'Sullivan and his ingenious spy network are largely forgotten outside specialist circles. How many other brilliant adaptations, clever resistances, and remarkable innovations have been lost simply because they occurred in the margins, carried out by people history doesn't typically remember? What do you think drove Séamus O'Sullivan to risk everything for 5 years, knowing that discovery meant certain death? Was he a patriot fighting for freedom, or a traitor endangering his community? The answer, perhaps, depends entirely on where you stand. Leave your theories in the comments. I read them all, and I'm genuinely curious how you see this complex story of resistance, espionage, and the extraordinary lengths humans will go to for their beliefs. If you found this forgotten chapter of Irish history as fascinating as I did, subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost stories from the shadows of the past. We uncover the mysteries that textbooks overlook, the strange, the dark, and the eerily human tales that reveal who we really are when tested by history. Next week, we're traveling to 1850s Louisiana to investigate the Magnolia Plantation letters, where coded messages hidden in embroidery patterns revealed an underground network helping enslaved people escape, operated by the plantation owner's own daughter. Until then, remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we're still discovering happened. See you in the next video.